Welcome to The Explainer. All right, today we're tackling a really tough subject. We're going to break down the core arguments from a very influential and, let's be honest, a pretty controversial book. It tries to draw a straight line from Islamic texts to modern terrorism. Now, just so we're clear, our job here isn't to agree or disagree. We're simply here to explain the specific framework the author presents.
So where does this violence actually come from? I mean, that's the big question, right? And it's the central question Dr. Mark A. Gabriel tries to answer in his book, Islam and Terrorism. His entire case is built on two things: his really unique personal story and his very specific reading of Islamic texts.
Okay, and I really want to double down on this before we go any further. It's super important for you to know that our goal here is not to endorse his views, and it's not to dispute them either. We're here to understand the argument exactly as he makes it. Think of us as your guide through his specific perspective. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into it.
All right, Section 1, a former insider's perspective. So first things first, who is this author, and why does he think he's the one who can answer this massive question? Well, according to him, his whole argument really hangs on his personal story, on his credibility as an insider.
So, the author's name is Mark Gabriel, and he really lays out his credentials right from the start. He was raised in a conservative Muslim family in Egypt, memorized the entire Quran by the time he was 12, and went on to get his doctorate from Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is a huge deal. He even became a professor of Islamic history there. Now, to give you some perspective, he says that for Sunni Muslims, Al-Azhar is kind of like the Vatican is for Catholics. It's that influential. And he argues this background is exactly what gives him a unique, insider's view of the ideology we're about to get into.
And he's very clear on this point. He says, and I'm quoting him here, "I want to make it very clear that Muslims are not my enemies. What I am trying to do is to help them and others see what motivates an Islamic radical." So he's really trying to draw a hard line here. He's saying his target is the ideology of radicalism, not the vast majority of Muslims, who he says just want to live in peace and, are often the biggest victims of this ideology themselves.
Okay, on to the next section, the 5 radical pillars. So what is the actual core of his argument? Where's the beef? Well, Gabriel structures his entire case around something he calls the 5 pillars of Islamic radicalism. He claims this framework is the absolute foundation for the entire radical movement.
And here they are. This slide, this is really the heart of his entire thesis. He's basically mapping out a mindset. You've got obey no law but Islamic law. Infidels are all around. Islam must rule. Jihad is the only way to win. And faith is the reason. The key takeaway here, according to the author, is that this isn't about politics. It's not about land or national grievances. He's arguing this is a purely religious foundation, a belief system that drives these groups.
And that third pillar, Islam must rule, leads directly to this next point. The author argues that for a true radical, your nationality, whether you're Egyptian or French or whatever, it means nothing. Your only loyalty is to something called Darul Islam, which basically means the House of Islam. So what's the end game? According to the book, the ultimate goal is to restore the caliphate and bring the entire world under Islamic authority.
So let's talk about jihad in the Quran. You might be wondering, okay, that's a pretty intense framework, but where does the author say it actually comes from? How is it justified? Well, he argues that radicals believe they find their mandate, their permission slip, if you will, directly in the Quran and in the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
And to illustrate this, Gabriel tells this really jarring story from his university days. One of his professors, Sheikh Omar Abdelrahman, told him, quote, "Jihad and killing are the head of Islam. If you take them out, you cut off the head of Islam." And, get this, that same professor was later convicted for his part in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. So the author uses this really personal, chilling story to show that this isn't just theory for him, it's a hardline perspective he saw firsthand.
Okay. So here's a big question that probably just popped into your head. What about all the verses in the Quran that talk about peace and tolerance? How do radicals get around those? Well, to explain that, the author introduces a really critical concept from Islamic law. It's called naskh, or abrogation. And honestly, you have to understand this one idea to get the rest of his argument. It's absolutely central. And this slide right here shows you exactly how naskh works, according to the author. On one side, you have what are called the Meccan verses. These came earlier in Muhammad's life. The book says there are about 114 verses that speak of kindness, forgiveness, stuff like, there is no compulsion in religion. But then on the other side, you have the Medinan verses, which came later. The author argues that these later verses, like the famous verse of the sword, were revealed when Muhammad was a military leader.
And according to the principle of abrogation, these later, more militant verses cancel out or override the earlier, peaceful ones. It's kind of like a software update that replaces the old code.
And he points to verses just like this one. Therefore, when you meet the unbelievers in fight, smite at their necks, as the textual proof, the direct command for violent jihad. This is what underpins that fourth pillar we talked about. Jihad is the only way to win. So, okay, we have the ideology, we have the supposed textual justification, but how does this all get put into practice? How does it go from book to battlefield? That's the crucial next step.
Which brings us to our next section, the 3 stages of jihad. The author's point here is that this isn't just random, chaotic violence. He argues there's a clear strategy, a 3-stage playbook that he says is modeled directly on the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
So here's the playbook. Stage 1, the weakened stage. This is when Muslims are a minority. The instruction, he says, is to live peacefully and focus on growing their numbers. Stage 2, the preparation stage. As they grow in numbers and influence, they start building strength and preparing to, as the text says, strike terror into enemy hearts. And finally, stage 3, the jihad stage. Once they're a powerful minority or a majority, the command is to actively fight to establish Islamic rule. The key variable here is strength. The strategy you use, he argues, depends entirely on how much power you have.
To make this theory feel more concrete, the book uses the Lebanese Civil War as a modern case study. So let's walk through it. It starts, he says, in stage 1, cooperation. He points to a time when the Muslim minority in Lebanon lived in relative harmony with the Christian majority because they didn't have significant political or military power.
But then, things started to shift. According to the author's analysis, Lebanon entered stage 2, preparation. This was in the 1970s. He states that as the Muslim population grew, they started getting support, money, weapons from places like Iran and Libya. This, he argues, was the phase of building up strength.
And that leads, finally, to stage 3, war. The author frames the brutal 20-year civil war that tore Lebanon apart as the final stage in action. He claims militant groups emerged with one clear goal: to overturn the government and establish an Islamic state. That, in his view, is the 3-stage playbook put into practice.
So there you have it. The author presents this as a complete, self-contained ideological system. We've walked through his personal background, the 5 pillars he lays out, his interpretation of the Quran, and the 3-stage strategy he believes is used to achieve the ultimate goal. Again, our goal was just to unpack this one very specific perspective on what motivates religious extremism, and it leaves us with a really heavy final thought. What happens when a conflict isn't driven by politics, which you can negotiate, but by ideology, by what one side believes is a direct, non-negotiable command from God?